Now, without further delay, let's begin today's event, sponsored by HSA Bank and hosted by Employee Benefit News and Employee Benefit Advisor. I would like to introduce your moderator for today, and that is Lynn Gresham, former editor-in-chief of Employee Benefit News and freelance writer. Lynn, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ian. Good day, everyone. We're pleased to have you with us for this web seminar, New Opportunities, Harnessing the Momentum of Health and Wealth Engagement. Our speaker today is Kevin Robertson. Kevin serves as Chief Revenue Officer with HSA Bank and is responsible for leading the organization's growth strategy and organization. He has worked for HSA Bank for nearly 10 years and has more than 25 years of experience in banking, insurance, and financial services. Kevin's background covers a variety of sales, business development, and operational roles and spans a diverse spectrum of employee benefits services. In addition to his tenure as a banking executive, he was also a self-employed business owner for 12 years, managing a large insurance operation with more than 25 separate agency locations. He also served as a financial industry regulatory authority registered representative and principal for 8 years. Kevin is a recognized expert in the consumer-directed healthcare industry, especially for his legislative and regulatory efforts as an executive board member of the American Bankers Association's HSA Council. HSA Bank, a division of Webster Bank, empowers consumers to make the most of their healthcare dollars. With over 20 years of experience, it is a trusted leader in the consumer-directed healthcare industry. HSA Bank provides health benefit solutions that include health savings accounts, flexible spending accounts, health reimbursement arrangements, commuter benefits, COBRA administration, and HSA retirement solutions such as HSA Advisor Plus to 3 million members and more than 35,000 employer groups. Now, I'm pleased to turn the program over to Kevin.
Thanks a lot, Lynn. I really appreciate the opportunity to come back with your audience. I love coming to this webinar every year because it's really the continuation of the story surrounding the convergence of health and wealth engagement. And it really is one of my favorite topics to speak on throughout the year, and this is one of my favorite audiences as well. So let's turn our attention to look at the topics at hand, and we're going to go over several areas. First, we're going to cover some insights on health and wealth engagement from our latest results of the Health and Wealth Index survey that we perform each year. Then we'll dive a little bit deeper into those learnings, dissect them a little bit, especially regarding the different demographic needs and some findings on consumer resilience. And that's especially important considering the pandemic that we've all been going through these days. Finally, we'll use these insights to talk about what employers and advisors can actually do with this knowledge to actually take action on it. So let's jump in with our findings from the Health and Wealth Engagement Survey for 2021. Any discussion at all of the current environment, we would be remiss without first reflecting on all the things that we've all had to go through over the past years. I'm sure that this has impacted all employees and consumers in every corner, every walk of life. Stepping back for a second to think about how much has changed in such a short amount of time, you may be surprised because if you're anything like most people, and I know I'm in this boat as well too, I think it's all kind of blended together. So when you stop and think about all the things that have changed over the last year, such as how much the work environment has changed, and how different the regulatory and landscape environment is. And I'm not just talking about the change of political control that we saw, obviously, from the 2020 election, but also the impact of the stimulus and where all of those things are going to go in the future. And finally, just how different people interact, because after all, we're used to that virtual engagement from work, from learning, from church to, quite honestly, the Zoom is in the new American lexicon of the 21st century because of all of this. And of course, it's wrapped around a certain level of uncertainty that is still going to be remaining there for quite some time. So as we turn to our discussion about the findings from this year's Health and Wealth Index, we just need to keep that in mind because it has undoubtedly impacted our findings. Now, you may or may not be familiar with the Health and Wealth Index that HSA Bank we had created back in 2017. And this is actually our fourth year of doing the index survey. And so what this really is, in case you're not familiar, this was the genesis of this really came from requests of our clients seeking for a simple tool to measure engagement in health and wealth. Not necessarily the actual health and wealth measurement, but again, a person's engagement of this. And the index survey is really to provide comparative baselines so that when we give tools and methods to take action to improve results, they actually have some comparison. Because after all, if we would just gave a person a score but they had no sense of comparison to that, it probably wouldn't mean as much. So, the methodology that we employ for the survey is we randomly select 2,000 U.S. adults, and we actually don't do it at HSA Bank. We actually use a professional outside firm that conducts these types of surveys, and they really apply, I will call, a very scientific or academic approach to it. They ask a series of questions that, again, measures a person's engagement in health and wealth, not their actual health and wealth, and then score it on a maximum of 100 points. Now, when you look at, and we've covered this, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we've covered this in concept in past years, but we find that people generally fall into one of four categories, either minimally, moderately, highly engaged, or optimally engaged. And really the way to think about this is that, the person in category one are people that just aren't consistently engaging in health or wealth. In the moderate category, these probably are folks that are engaging some, maybe one, perhaps more broadly or deeply than another. When you get into category three of the highly engaged, now these are people that are really showing deliberate action and that they are at least somewhat consistent in their health and wealth engagement. And then finally, at the optimally engaged, these are people who I would say are deeply engaged in the health and wealth environment. Now, just as in similar into years past, the breakdown of the index scores, you'll find that the majority of folks happen to fall into one of the two middle tiers. I don't think that comes as a surprise. If you've seen this on a bell curve before, you probably would have been surprised to see it look anything other than that. But there was some interesting findings. We're going to dissect these a little bit more deeply in a couple slides. But to start with the average score increased slightly from 2020. Last year was 56.4. I actually, even though it was largely unchanged, I would say 1 point isn't a huge numeric change. I would say that that's actually notable considering the pandemic environment that we're in. But it is important to note that this year and 2020's results were lower than in past years. And for the years prior to that, we were closer into the 62 range. So, I thought this was perhaps one of the most telling key findings that we had was that we saw a 9% increase in those reporting that they were actually saving for their future health care needs. We've reached a point now that half of the people reported that they either frequently or occasionally save for future health care costs. That's a 9% increase on a raw numeric basis, but if you actually consider it on a percentage of change, it's actually more than 20%. So to see that kind of change in 1 year was very surprising to me. We really don't know exactly why, but I think the hypothesis anyways is that there's a possible pandemic influence, and we'll have to see if this continues into the future. If you look, we did every year we divide all of the data and we look at different demographic components, and we'll get into this in just a second in different demographic slides. But before I do that, we've reached a point where I'd like to actually get some audience participation. So I'm going to turn it over to Lynn to take us into the first of our polling questions. So Lynn.
Thanks, Kevin. Our question is, which demographic group do you think is most engaged with their health and wealth? Would it be Gen Z, the millennials, Gen X, or the baby boomers? Just choose one and be sure to hit the submit button. We'll give it a couple more seconds for people to vote. Let's give it a few more minutes. People seem to be taking their time. All right, let's close the poll now, Kevin, and see what we have. 36% of people said baby boomers, and then the next choice was Gen Xers, followed by millennials. How did the audience do, Kevin?
Well, I'll tell you what, and for this year, the surprise that I saw was to see that Gen Xers had the highest score at 59.2. But I do want to call something very interesting out, and I've got a good slide that will demonstrate this. One of the unique elements that I found so remarkable was a drop in the scores in the younger generations. We saw a big drop, especially in Gen Z. Now, Gen Z and millennials were significantly lower, but that Gen Z population was very surprising to see that much numeric change in a given year. This is a very statistically significant population at several thousand Americans. So seeing that big of a change really is a signal of something. Now, of course, there could be many factors to this. My hypothesis is that this population was likely more deeply impacted by the pandemic. Typically, obviously, the younger you are, typically you find lower wage earners, many gig workers, especially in the Gen Z population. And quite honestly, I think the pandemic may have impacted their lifestyle and their financial situation and their financial practices to a higher degree. So very interesting to see that. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, when you look at the older Americans, we continue to see the same financially concern and reality that was reported in previous years. Of the people age 55 and above, 93%, so the overwhelming majority of them, had reported that they worry about their future medical expenses, yet of that same 55 and older population, only 30% of those say that they never save for future medical expenses, right? So you have this disparity because they worry about it, but yet they're not doing something about it. And I think this underscores the importance of engaging population, and not just the senior population, but all demographics, to save early and to save often, to head this off at the pass. Now, if you look, we also a number of other demographic components that we analyze. We do, and we've seen the same results with health plans over the last couple of years. So if you look at the results by health plan, we continue to see the highest engagement scores in the high deductible health plan population and the lowest scores in the public plan populations. We also look at, for instance, gender. The gender-based analysis yields a few significant points. First of all, women actually fell just a hair. They were down to 54.3 overall versus 55.5 last year. But again, this is down from scoring in the 63 range in prior years. Men actually improved slightly from 60.5 from 57.3. Again, slightly lower than what we've seen in years past, but again, we saw the gap widening here. Our hypothesis is that we know that women were more disproportionately impacted by job loss in the pandemic, and we're thinking that may have been one of the drivers here to widen this gap. Now, on married folks have consistently, they continue to experience higher scores than single folks. Again, this is more than likely because of a larger percentage of dual income households, providing more financial stability in the marital ranks. Again, overall scores, you saw a 61.2 this year versus 58.6 last, so a little bit of improvement. And the single went to 53.9 this year from 54.4 last year. So again, fairly stable, down a little bit in single, a little bit of improvement on the married ranks, but definitely you continue to see that marriage influences the health and wealth scores. Given the pandemic, I wanted to spend just a couple minutes speaking about some positive trends that we found in what we're calling consumer resilience. You know, despite the pandemic, consumers overwhelmingly reported that they still have good confidence in their physical health. It did drop just a hair, but I would say that within a 2%, that's within the margin of error. So I would say that this still is very, very strong. And they reported that their ability to manage their health needs remained very, very strong. They also overwhelmingly feel that their health plans help them to be more prepared for their medical needs while managing their costs. So the confidence in their health, physical health, their ability to manage their health needs and their health plan remains pretty darn high. We also saw a nice jump in those people that said that they're paying attention to what healthcare costs and consider those in their decision process around healthcare. That has reached 60%, and we've seen that steadily increase over time. This is actually especially poignant given the recent regulatory changes last year surrounding health plan transparency, and as a result, we expect this number to continue to climb in future years. You know, this next insight is really positive, especially when you consider the impact of the pandemic and what it's had on lifestyle and activities. Overwhelmingly, people reported that they tried to make, some type of lifestyle improvement to their health over the last year. We saw this high number hold true not just across the genders, but also across age. And for instance, we saw the number reported at 80% for those aged 65 and older. So it wasn't just the younger folks that said they were trying to make lifestyle improvements to improve their health. We saw this in the older categories as well, too. So once again, we've reached poll questions. So I'll take a second to ask Lynn to take us into this for just a second.
Okay, great. Well, taking advantage of that momentum, what positive lifestyle changes would you like to promote to your employees this year? Please select all that apply. Would you like to encourage them to quit smoking, reduce alcohol consumption, exercise more, eat healthy, improve or focus on mental health, reduce stress, or get better sleep? Again, you can check as many as apply. We do have a large audience today, so I'm going to give you a little bit of time to record your answers. Kevin, it's going to be interesting to see the results of this. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and we're going to take a look at results. It's quite well distributed. Improve and focus on mental health got the lion's share of the votes at 84%. Next was reduce stress, eat healthy, exercise more, came in third. Kevin, what do you think about these results?
Yeah, I think this is great, and I apologize. I muted myself when you asked me the last question. I guess that's the signs of the times, right? But, I would have loved to have asked this question and kept the results for before the pandemic so that we could actually compare after the pandemic. But I can tell you the one that does not surprise me at all is that improve or focus on mental health, because I think we will all agree that this has been a very trying year on the mental health of everyone, right? And we have a lot of new worries that we didn't have a year or 13 months ago. But, very intriguing information. So, on that vein, let's take a second. And we talked about the positive. I think we also need to take a look at some of the negatives, too. Just as what we've seen in years past, overall health care cost understanding actually stayed low. This chart is just representing it's showing the percentage of people that report in each category of demographic, whether or not they know what their health plan deductible is. And as you can see, it doesn't matter what age category you're in, people just generally say that they don't know their deductible. And the deductible is probably the most visible or one of the most visible attributes of health costs, right? And we've talked about this a lot in past years. So this, again, just highlights that we still have a long way to go to fully educate consumers on healthcare costs and ultimately the engagement of that. Now, this is another troubling data find, and I can tell you it makes sense to me due to the shutdowns, but I think you can attribute this directly to the pandemic impact and the shutdown impact, because we saw a steep decline in the reported use of preventative care this year. Unfortunately, this really steps us in a backwards direction on the progress. I mean, I think everyone on this call can appreciate the efforts that have been made for the last, say, decade to really carry the flag forth to making sure that preventative care is utilized properly. And this is a troubling drop. I guess it is to be expected, but the key here is that we need to make sure that we get these people, restarting with their habits around preventative care after that we get back to normalcy after the pandemic. So where does this leave us, right? We just went through a number of findings, but more than what the data tells us, we need to share some ideas on opportunities of exactly how we can react to those findings. I'll tell you this much. My perspective on this is if there was a silver lining to the pandemic, it's probably that Americans are more willing to engage in their health and well-being than ever before. And I say this because they have a certain openness to change that the pandemic has probably brought about, having them thinking a little bit more about their own health and well-being that wasn't there before. In addition to that, they're really a captive audience because, again, they're still under a lot of restrictions. What else are they going to do right now? But while this window of opportunity is there, it's something that I unfortunately think that this window of opportunities for employers and people to latch onto is going to close in the not too distant future. So I think it's important to not miss out on this opportunity and get started now. So, when you're thinking about this, employers actually have a lot more levers to impact engagement than they often realize. I think there are some obvious ones like their plan design and their plan economics, but then also, I call this environment, I think their overall benefit structure and how they fit this into an overall cohesive and deliberate communication strategy there are engagement levers that are probably not fully utilized. This is probably, as one of the largest health account administrators in the United States, this is by far probably the most common question we get asked from employers is really, hey, what are some keys or best practices to engage employees more deeply? And what we found is they fall into really one of four categories. And our recommendations are that they require an active enrollment, show some skin in the game, being aggressive with the tools that they have, and that they facilitate involvement. Now, over the next few slides, I'm actually going to unpackage each of these concepts, but keep in mind that these really transcend employer size, employee demographics, plan types, and more. I mean, ultimately, they do apply pretty much universally to just about everyone, and regardless of their complexity or plan options and that. So let's actually unpackage the first key element is active enrollment. And what I'm talking about here is avoiding a default approach. And I know that this takes extra work, but you have to remember that just defaulting people into their same plan and their plan elections year after year after year doesn't move the needle. So we recommend considering making people actively choose their plans. However, you can't just leave them to their own devices. You need to help them do the math. So it's highly recommended that you use some kind of decision support, since ultimately there's lots of data on this, but the majority of people are just not in their optimal plan option. The bottom line is that for most Americans, most employees probably buy more health insurance than they actually need. A ton of research, like I said, has been put into this topic, and some of what you're seeing on the screen, this is actually from TIAA. This is actually a report that they had generated last year, and I grabbed a data point from it. But what TIA had published was that they found that more than half of all people are overpaying by at least $1,350 per year for their health insurance elections. If you translate it into a percentage of earnings, it's actually a full 2% of their salary. So in other words, more than a half of all people electing health insurance are paying too much by a tune of 2% of their entire income. They also found that number increases in a full 25% of people are overpaying by more than $2,000, which translates to more than 4% of their salary. And they've also found that very few people are optimized. Now, when we're talking about, and I could spend hours talking about decision support, and I'm not even in the decision support business, but ultimately that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It takes many forms, from basic online calculators through very intensive one-on-one coaching. My point here is that whatever you do, at least consider it, because the outcomes that you get from decision support are definitely very strong, and you're going to generate an increase in employee confidence in their benefits. They're going to have a more equitable benefit environment, and when the day is done, it's going to save not only the employees more money, but it's going to save typically the employer a significant amount of money as well too. The second element that I wanted to point is that employers really need to show skin in the game. This is a psychological investment more than just a financial one, because ultimately the employee, when they see the employer showing some skin in the game, I think that it gives the employee more confidence and involvement and more nudge to be involved in a deeper basis of understanding and utilizing proper decisioning in their health care. I think it starts with utilizing aggressive plan pricing, and I'm just going to use an adjacency in my core business. If, for instance, you're using an HSA-based plan, we highly recommend that you make some amount of seed contribution and a matching contribution structure so that you're encouraging employee payroll contribution participation. If I were to graphically represent what I just said, and I think this is a probably easier way to kind of visualize the concept. If you were to kind of look at the cost versus the engagement and kind of map this out on different quadrants, in the lower left quadrant, if you just, cost shift higher deductibles, for instance, onto the employee with and no employer seed contribution or those types of things, they're going to have lower engagement. But the actions that you take when your plan designs, they may come at a slight cost, but drive significantly higher engagement. That, for instance, if you start making matching contribution or combine that also with a financial seed and try to cover more and more of the deductible, you end up getting a significantly higher increase in the engagement level. Next, I'd like to talk about, because this folds in nicely, which is being aggressive with your tools. And let me explain what I'm talking about there. First, you need to make sure that you align your pricing to your desired outcomes. And it doesn't matter if you're a self-funded plan or buying insurance, because obviously you can kind of control your plan costs with how much you put towards your premium subsidies. But ultimately, that if you want deeper participation in a particular plan type, then you need to make it work to their advantage price-wise. I know this is stating the obvious, but I also see it, a lot of times the employer's not putting thought in terms of what they're trying to drive in terms of plan participation or plan optimization. So you definitely need to spend time considering it. But then you also need to think about, well, how do I get employees to be involved. And one of the great tools that we're starting to see employers use more of in the healthcare environment is negative elections. Now, this is a connotation, as you probably are well aware, in the retirement industry around essentially negative elections mean that you default people into making payroll contributions. I'll talk more about this in a few slides, but ultimately, negative election means that it's the opposite of making positive consent, if that makes sense. And really all this does is it makes it easier for your employees to get started in payroll contributions because it's one less step for them to take. I have some caveats there that you have to keep in mind, which I'll talk about in just a minute, but I wanted to talk that as well as making sure that you have a strong matching strategy, because this really creates the right behaviors and habits of your employees. I've presented on this a number of times before in terms of the power of matching contributions, but if you just follow this scenario, it's a pretty simple concept. If you, for instance, had in scenario A an employer that was just seeking to make a $1,000 seed contribution, for instance, into their employee's account. So they're putting $1,000 in a seed, and the employee is not putting any of their money into the account, but then they spend $500 of that $1,000 on expenses in a given year. When the day is done, they saved $500 when the year is done. But in the next scenario, if the employer was actually to split the $1,000 into a $500 seed contribution and then match dollar for dollar up to the other $500, what you end up, if the employee still spends that same $500 from their account, the net impact is that they actually have an extra $500 because they did a matching contribution. They ended up with $1,000. It's the same investment in the employer, but yields a higher balance and has a higher engagement level when the day is done. I'm not actually even being fair to myself, because when I said that it's the same investment by the employer, technically it actually saves the employer a little bit of money. The reason is because every dollar that an employee would put through a payroll contribution, and that actually reduces your obviously your FICA burden on taxes and so on and so forth. And if the people don't take advantage of the match, obviously you're making a lower seed contribution. So I think this strategy is very sound. If I look at the combined impact of this over time and visually map it out, you can see the net result. It doubles the trajectory. But more important than the trajectory of the savings in this employee's account is the engagement change, because the statistic on the right-hand side of the screen, this actually comes from a Willis Towers Watson survey, but it points to the fact that the majority of employees report that they would increase their HSA contributions each year if they were only provided the ability of a matching contribution. So when I kind of sum this all up and roll this into the big picture, it never ceased to amaze me, but I just don't see matching contributions as aggressively used. They're becoming more and more prevalent today, but I think that there's just been a missed opportunity over the last decade or so in this front. Because, you can look to the 401k match, for example. The 401k match is understood and universally practiced, but when you look at this in a healthcare setting, when the day is done, it's going to encourage, that active role. It's going to increase balances. It's going to save money for the employer, the employee, and it's going to improve the value perception of the benefits and, of course, improve the employee's retirement readiness. So if you don't take anything else from me today, take this. Consider making matching contributions part of your plan. So I'm curious, though, as to how many of you might use this concept today. So I'm actually going to turn this over to Lynn to ask our final poll question for the day.
Great, Kevin. For you in the audience, do you currently use matching contribution strategies? Answer choices are yes, only in my retirement plan, yes, in both my retirement plan and my HSA plan, yes, only in my HSA plan, or no, not at all. This is a single answer. And again, I'm going to give the group more time to answer. All right, let's take a look at what the audience has said. 54% said they only offer matching contributions in their retirement plans, and 28% said in both the retirement plan and the HSA. 14% said they don't do anything in terms of matching contributions. Kevin, would you please comment on these results?
Yeah, I'm actually encouraged. To tell you the truth, I was not expecting the match in both the retirement and the HSA plan to be quite that high. I think that's great. So to everybody on the phone, kudos to you all. I think that's very forward thinking. So great to see the progress we're making there. So
why do you think there's reluctance there, Kevin?
Yeah, that's a great question. I tell you, I think it's probably because of one of two things. Either number one, I think initially it was lack of understanding how to do it. I think that's probably the initial challenge that, I think the initial thrust of the industry was to get contributions going, get payroll contributions going, and I think they just were fearful of what it would take to make it happen on the match. And I think the second piece of that is the mechanics piece, right? Because you might be involving payroll companies, you may have to do different functions and so on and so forth. But I think the industry and employers have gotten a lot more comfortable around that. So I think it was it wasn't really a reluctance. I think it was a lack of knowledge or a lack of familiarity. And then I think the second one was mechanics. But I think both of those have largely either been solved or are being solved. Great question, though.
Well, thanks for that insight. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So let's look at the final key here to engagement is really to facilitate involvement. And what I mean by this is, first of all, spend time looking at your demographics and determine how, if and how you might want to engage different people in those different demographics differently. I'll share some insights on this in just a second, but I think the next thing is make sure not to try and rush people through the process. Let's face it, pretty much everybody on this call knows how stressful open enrollment can be, and how a lot of people wait until the 11th hour to make decisions. But I think giving adequate time and resources to make those decisions, especially if you use an active enrollment, is really key. And then finally, use all of the tools that are at your disposal to help drive an outcome. So if I were to look, this was some other research that we did last year. We do this actually every year. We actually have some research that we poll Americans from a broad cross-section of the workforce. Last year, we actually interviewed 1,200 consumers from around the country, and it's got a pretty good demographic split. It's about 50-50 between men and women. They had a broad cross-section of incomes, and more than half had incomes less than $75,000. And about 60% of these people reported that they had earned a 4-year degree or higher. So I think we've got a good cross-section, and I think we can look to this to really give us some insights. Now, we've actually published a number of different data elements on this. I'm just going to pick one or two. But I thought one of the key questions that we asked the audience was, what tools or resources do you utilize during open enrollment to help you make your health plan decisions? So again, these are the people actually enrolling. And we said, well, what did you use? And what you're seeing in the dark green is what was reported in 18, and the light green was 19, and then the kind of light blue was 2020. And if you look, this is, talking about web content, meeting with HR, flyers, brochures, presentations, videos, online calculators, webinars, or many people reported none. So this is a very broad list of resources. But if I were actually to summarize and say, well, what does this tell me? What I would say is that people need and utilize a lot of different tools, right? It's not one single thing that's going to get them to understand this. It's probably a combination of resources, and having, different practices for different demographics and taking that into consideration, I think, is really important. And it's obvious that last year that we saw a significant increase in those reporting that they used virtual resources. Well, obviously that's to be expected in 2020. But we also, when asked, the same audience, how could your employer make open enrollment easier for you in the future? These employees reported overwhelmingly that they desired better comparisons of options and more time to make the decision. So, this gets back to decision support and the engagement, and then I think this might provide you guys some insights as you think about what you're going to do next year for the next open enrollment. You may want to just consider those options. Now, it was important to note that they also wanted to see more tools, right? So they reported that they did want to see more tools, and with that in mind, there are a ton of resources from a lot of different sources, whether it be your health plan, your advisor, other peer groups, and not just traditional tools. For instance, feel free, even if you're not our customer, you don't have to be a client to have this because it's publicly accessible. But if you want your employees to take the Health and Wealth Index calculator for themselves, it only takes a few minutes, and they access it from our website, and it's completely free to use. So my point there is just make sure that you use the tools that are available to you. The last thing that I want to talk about before we wrap up the day is a couple of quick PSAs around some potential pitfalls to avoid. And I would say that these really fall into a couple of different categories. The first is, again, when you're looking at your population, try and recognize specific challenges that may be within your population. An easy one to think about is smoking, right? So if you have a high instance of smoking in your population, perhaps you want to use a smoking cessation program. But again, you can take this under a lot of different contexts depending on what your wellness strategy is and so on and so forth. I want to make sure that we don't forget to engage employees, especially this year coming out of the pandemic, about getting back to utilizing their preventative care. I think that's a really important message for this year. Remember, don't forget to talk to them about their benefits year-round, right? Again, I know that we've had a lot of different things to manage, and you probably had bigger fish to fry with managing a business in the pandemic, but let's not forget those components. You may want to consider subsidizing lower paid employees to a higher degree. I think this is especially, concerning because of the economic reality of the pandemic, right? And plan equity is I think, going to become more prevalent in the future. And remember, you can always discriminate in favor of your lower paid employees. So that's something to think about as you march towards 22 planning. And then finally, and this is, again, probably stating the obvious, don't try to boil the ocean here. Just pick one or two or three things, no more than that, to focus on in a given year, and then put all of your efforts into executing those, right? Don't try and do everything all at once because you're probably not going to be successful. The last PSA I'll throw out there is around negative elections, just because, again, you're starting to see this become more prevalent. And in other words, this, again, what I'm referencing here is defaulting to a set percentage of payroll contribution amounts. Obviously, this encourages savings behavior. It gets them started, and it's one less step that they have to do. But just as a reminder, you need to make sure that you're providing proper notification to employees. You need to provide the ability to modify or opt out those elections, and obviously have a properly structured cafeteria and plan documents if you go down that path. So just a friendly PSA on negative elections. So, Lynn, I think we've reached the end of our materials, and we're going to now open it up to some Q&A. So, Lynn, would you be willing to moderate those questions for us?
Absolutely, and we already have a few submitted. The first one I'd like to ask Kevin is, do you have any studies on what employees value more, a lower deductible on an HDHP or a contribution to an HSA?
That's a great question. I would, if you can, whoever submitted that one at the end of the show, I have my email address in the last slide, and if you send me your email address, I will try and send that to you. I've got some research. Some of it is more generic than others, but I do actually have some research on that. I would tell you that when the day is done, I would highly recommend if you wanted to get to, for instance, an employee's out-of-pocket, let's just say whether you got there at let's say a $2,000 deductible, or if you went, for instance, a $3,000 deductible with a $1,000 employer contribution. Regardless, if you were to do forced with those two decisions, I think having a contribution being made by the employer is the right strategy to utilize. And the reason is, I go back to that psychological impact to the employees. That demonstrates the employer's got some skin in the game. So even though it's the same dollars and cents to you, it really does go a long way. If I look at, for instance, analysis of employees' contribution dynamics, in other words, how much they contribute to accounts, how often they contribute, as well as their spending dynamics, how much they're spending out of the accounts. When we see accounts that are getting an employer contribution, the result to the employee is a much stronger habit of contribution by the employee and a much stronger habit of distribution by the employee. So I think that's important to consider in that decisioning.
Thanks very much. Are you required to complete discrimination testing for HSA matching?
So first of all, anytime that it's a great question, and again, I could spend all day talking about comparability and non-discrimination rules. The quick 30-second explanation is yes. Of course, anytime that you're facilitating employer contributions, and a payroll contribution and a matching contribution has to be done in the cafeteria plan. So non-discrimination rules would apply, and it would be captured in your non-discrimination testing, whether you do it, if you outsource it, however you're doing it, they will take that into consideration. Again, a quick PSA, if you do not use a cafeteria plan, if you don't have a Section 125 plan, you cannot do payroll contributions, you cannot do matching contributions, you cannot do any of that, and you would be subject to comparability. However, I'm going to guess most employers, especially those on this call, are probably utilizing a cafeteria plan, and as such, they can do payroll contributions, they can do seed contributions, they can do wellness contributions, they can do a number of different structures or a combination thereof. They would just want to take that into consideration when they're doing the discrimination testing and plan design.
What trends are you seeing, or do you anticipate, in benefit design and enrollment this year, Kevin?
Well, that's a loaded question. It could go a lot of different ways. If I think about it, I'm gonna frame my answer with three things that I see as a trend that I are pretty safe bets. Number one, and I know this again, stating the obvious, but continued virtual engagement. As much as we would love to have the pandemic in our rear view mirror, I don't think it is yet, and I don't think that employers are going to be in a rush to go 100% back in the office. And as such, I think thinking about how to engage people virtually is going to be the norm. I also think that that's going to continue because the percentage of the workforce that I think is going to remain in a remote environment is going to remain elevated and probably will be potentially forever. And so I think virtual engagement is a big trend to think about. I also think that plan design changes, we did not see a significant number of employers kind of changing what they had last year. I would characterize what we saw was that a lot of them were stuck in neutral. I think when the shutdown happened, the pandemic hit, it was, they had to transition workforce, they had to adjust their business models and so on and so forth. And I think what they ended up doing was saying, hey, unless we had a big need, let's just leave our benefits alone for the year. And I think health plans took that same approach. But as we're thinking into this year, and of course the financial realities of the pandemic, I think are going to be felt this year and next. So I think you're going to see plan design changes from the employer, and probably see increased interest in consumer-directed healthcare of all types. And the reason is not only because the employer might be pushing it a little bit harder, but employees are going to gravitate towards it because, again, the financial belt tightening that happens as a result of the pandemic. So I think those are the three major trends that you're going to see in at least the next year.
Great. Now that we have a new administration, do you expect any legislation that could change HSA participation levels?
Boy, another loaded question. I'm gonna try and tap my crystal ball or reading in the tea leaves or whatever one other way I can try and answer this question. I can tell you this much. As far as President Biden's administration is concerned, he's been very transparent with his objectives of what are the healthcare priorities, and these will carry over into the congressional priorities as well, too. First and foremost was dealing with the pandemic. And number one, and number two was shoring up the Affordable Care Act. Obviously, it doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum you're on. Obviously the Trump administration, made impacts to the Affordable Care Act and different provisions in healthcare. And I think that now that the Democrats are in charge in the White House and have control of both houses of Congress right now, they're going to try and revert some of those changes or shore up the Affordable Care Act. So they've been very transparent in terms of what their objectives are going to be. Whether or not that will translate into different impacts to the HSA or CDH industries, don't yet know. There has been a lot of progress and favorable wins behind the sales for the last several administrations around HSAs and health savings accounts. And in fact, in the last couple Congresses, we saw a lot of very favorable bills that actually received bipartisan support, back to the ACA and the BICRA bills in 2018, and the Barrett-Smith bill, for instance, in last Congress, seeking to authorize Medicare enrollees to be able to have and contribute to an HSA, so on and so forth. So I think we're going to see not earth-shattering changes. Quite honestly, you're not going to see a complete, we'll say the reality is you're not going to see replacement, for instance, of the private health insurance market with a single-payer government-run system. You're not going to see that in this Congress. There's just not enough votes, with such a narrowly split Congress to get something that sweeping done. It's just not going to happen. So I think the changes are going to be smaller and really focused on helping people deal with the pandemic or better afford health care. And I think HSAs and CDH are going to benefit in some way from that.
Okay, what do you believe is driving the low levels of understanding in healthcare expenses?
So I'm gonna say it's probably two things. One of which is probably the age-old challenge of motivation. Let's face it, healthcare and healthcare decisioning, it isn't easy, and it probably isn't something that people really want to address. It's something that typically, most people don't address healthcare until they have a need for it, as opposed to being proactive and saving for the future and so on and so forth. So I would say the motivation has always been low, although what we've seen in statistics will bear this out to be true. Over the last decade, for sure, you've seen that increase, over time. And to my point earlier about the maybe a potential silver lining of the pandemic, is I think that you're going to see, that increase. I think the second reason is, quite honestly, the lack of transparency in health costs. One of the things that I think is going to be a game changer, it'll be a little bit of time before we really start seeing this, but obviously the regulatory changes that happened late last year regarding health plan transparency and the requirements of the transparency in networks and health plans, I think that's going to have a far-reaching and very dramatic impact on people's approach to transparency and engagement. It's going to take some time to get there, but I think that's a little bit of a reason that it has been so low, but simultaneously there's some good news on that front as well, too. So I think anything we can do to help people have the tools, have the insights, and have the education to make better healthcare decisioning possible, it's going to generate really much more solid results for them.
Okay, well, we are going to have to leave it there. Thank you all for your questions. And Kevin, I'm going to hand it over to you for your final remarks.
Sure. So first of all, if you'd like more information on our Health and Wealth Index, or if you'd like anything else from some of the insights, again, I just gave you a snapshot of them, but if you'd like to download a copy of the full white paper for yourself, you can do it here. If you needed copies of the older versions, again, we publish this every year with our new findings as the new survey is completed. You can access those from our website, and they are free to download. With that, I want to take a second to thank you for your involvement today, and thank you to you, Lynn, for moderating, doing such a great job as you always do, and thank you to EBABN for a great audience. That's really all I have. My contact information is here. If anybody has to reach me, I can tell you that probably the best way to get a hold of me is email, and I will do my best to get back to you on a timely basis if you have any questions. With that, I'll turn it over to EBABN.
Okay, well, this does conclude our seminar. If we didn't get to your question, HSA Bank will follow up with you offline. Thanks very much for joining us today for the webcast. We know you found it valuable. I'd especially like to thank Kevin for taking the time and sharing his insights and expertise with us. Also, a special thank you to HSA Bank for sponsoring this event. If you missed any part of the presentation, you'll be able to listen to a recorded version within 48 hours on the EBN and EBA websites. And we'll be sending you an email with a link to the recording. Thanks again for being with us, and have a great rest of your day.